My parents had only one rule: no dating before marriage. For 24 years, I obeyed every rule while my friends enjoyed ordinary relationships. Then my mom introduced me to Timothy, a perfect old-fashioned man from my dad's church circle who wanted to wed me. We met 12 times, always watched, always in our parents' living rooms. He proposed after 3 months and I accepted. Can you imagine building your entire life around one single, ironclad rule set by your parents, only to find out that rule was actually a twisted trap? A cover-up for a decades-old secret? Because that's what happened to me. I almost married my own half-brother, and my father was the one who arranged it. My parents' rule was simple, yet utterly mind-boggling. No dating until marriage. Seriously. Not a typo. They meant I couldn't even think about spending time with someone unless we were already engaged. It was pure, unadulterated 1950s courtship, straight out of a dusty old textbook my grandma probably had in her attic. Supervised visits only. No holding hands. No private conversations. Nothing. And I, the obedient daughter, followed every single rule. Through high school, I watched my friends sneak off to movies, whispering and holding hands in the hallways, while I went straight home after volleyball practice. In college, I politely turned down party invitations and coffee dates, always with that sheepish apology: my family just has different values. Some people thought I was lying. Some probably thought I was in a cult. But all I ever wanted was to make my parents proud. By 24, though, I started to wonder, had I made a terrible mistake? Was I destined to be alone, all because of a rule? Then one morning, Mom burst into my room, practically vibrating with excitement. She said she had someone she wanted me to meet. I started to protest, the usual mom, you know how I feel spiel, but she cut me off. His name was Timothy, from the Brianna family, a big name in Dad's church network. She gushed about how wonderful, how traditional they were. And then she dropped the bomb. Timothy had specifically asked about meeting me. I should have asked more questions. I should have demanded to know why a complete stranger was inquiring about me. But I was exhausted, tired of being the only 24-year-old in my entire social circle who'd never even held hands with a guy. So, against my better judgment, I agreed. We met that Sunday right after service. Timothy was handsome, clean-cut, almost too perfect. Dark hair, a dazzling smile, impeccable posture. He shook my hand formally, called my father sir, and told me it was a pleasure to finally meet me, that my parents had told him so much about me. We sat in our living room, Mom bustling in with coffee and cookies, while Dad perched in his armchair like a hawk, watching our every move. When I asked what he did, Timothy said he worked in finance. Nothing too exciting. But then he added, I've been praying for a wife who shares my values, someone who understands the importance of family and faith. Wife. That word should have sent sirens blaring. We'd known each other for maybe 11 minutes. But my parents, they were absolutely beaming. Over the next 3 months, Timothy and I saw each other twice a week. Always at my parents' house or his. Always supervised. He wanted 4 children, I wanted 3. Felt normal. Predictable. Safe. I called my best friend Melanie one night, practically whispering, Mel, I think he's the one. Her response was immediate and blunt. You've never even been alone with him. Don't you think you should actually date him first? I reminded her. That's not how my family does things. And she, bless her heart, retorted, Your family's way is insane. But when Timothy proposed, after our 12th visit, down on one knee in my parents' living room, with both sets of parents watching, I said yes. His mother hugged me, calling me her daughter. We set the wedding date for 4 months out. That's when I started noticing the small things. The way Timothy was always exactly on time, never a minute early. The way he never, ever suggested we bend the rules. Not even a quiet walk, or a real conversation without an audience. Just perfectly compliant. When I mentioned it to Mom, she dismissed my concerns. He's just respectful, she'd say. This is what you wanted in a husband, isn't it? And his stories. He talked about his childhood a lot, but the details were always so vague. I grew up in the Midwest instead of a city name. My parents moved around for work, instead of saying what his dad did. It was like he was reading from a script. One evening while washing dishes with Dad, I brought it up. It's weird, don't you think, how Timothy never talks specifics about his past? Never mentions a city. Dad brushed it off, saying his father traveled for work. But I pressed him. What kind of work? What city, Dad? He put down a plate, his voice suddenly sharp. Kimberly, why are you asking all these questions? Timothy is a good man from a good family. That's what matters. That night, after my parents were asleep, I opened my laptop. I searched Timothy, his full last name, finance companies, our city. Nothing. I checked social media. All private except one profile created just 6 months ago with no photos. The next morning I called the church office. I explained I was marrying Timothy from the Brianna Family Network and just needed to confirm some membership details for our wedding program. There was a pause on the other end. Then the secretary's voice, quiet, hesitant. Honey, the Brianna family doesn't have anyone named Timothy in their network. My stomach dropped. I drove straight to my parents' house. Dad was alone in the garage. Who is Timothy, really? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Dad's face went white. He started to say my name, but I cut him off louder this time. Who is he? Dad sank onto his workbench, a defeated man. He's your half-brother, he mumbled. My world shattered. My what? He confessed. A 26-year-old affair, before I was born, with Timothy's mother. It was a mistake. She moved away. I sent money. Then the real horror. When Timothy reached out last year wanting to connect, I panicked. Your mother doesn't know. I thought, if I could bring him into the family properly through marriage to you, I could legitimize him without admitting the truth. You weren't supposed to find out. You were just supposed to follow the rules. I left without saying another word. I called Timothy, or whatever his real name was, and told him I knew everything. He started crying, saying he was sorry, that Dad had manipulated him too, promised him a place in the family if he went along with this insane plan. Okay, so you're probably all wondering what happened next. Honestly, I've been sitting here for days trying to figure out how to even start explaining it, because what I thought was the worst thing imaginable, that was just the beginning of this absolute nightmare. When I left Dad in that garage looking like his world was crumbling, I drove straight to Melanie's. I don't even remember the drive. 1 minute I was pulling out of my parents' driveway, the next I was in her parking lot, my hands shaking so bad I could barely turn off the engine. Melanie took one look at my face and pulled me inside wordlessly. I told her everything. The whole twisted story. Dad's affair, Timothy being my half-brother, this absolutely insane plan to marry us off just to legitimize him. Melanie just stared at me for a solid minute before she finally said, "What the actual F*** is wrong with your father?" Not even a question, just a raw statement. She paced her living room, unable to process it. She asked if Mom knew. When I said no, she stopped pacing and stared at me like I'd grown a second head. That's when my phone started going crazy. Group texts from the wedding planning chat Mom had created with me, her, and Timothy's supposed mother, who I now realized was probably his actual mother. Messages about cake tastings, flower arrangements, photographer schedules. Every notification made me want to throw my phone across the room. Melanie grabbed it, turned it face down, and said, "You need to figure out what you're doing, and you need to do it fast. This isn't going away." I knew I had to talk to Timothy again, but not over the phone, where he could hide behind tears and excuses. I needed to see his face, to figure out if he was really just another victim in Dad's sick plan, or if he'd been in on it the whole time. So I texted him, "Meet me Thursday afternoon, food court, mall. Public place. Lots of people. Nowhere for either of us to make a scene." I sat at a table near the Panda Express. When he walked up, I didn't stand, didn't hug him. Didn't do any of the things I would have done a week ago when I thought he was my fiancé. I just looked at him and waited. He sat down and immediately launched into apologies. How sorry he was, how he never meant for any of this to happen, how Dad had promised him a family, a place to belong. I cut him off. "Start from the beginning. Tell me everything. When did you find out Dad was your father? When did this plan start? And how the hell did you think marrying your own sister was going to work out?" Timothy looked around nervously, then leaned in, lowering his voice. He said he'd known about Dad his whole life. His mother had told him when he was 12 that his father was married with another family. She'd even shown him pictures, told him Dad's name and where he lived. Timothy grew up in Wisconsin, watching from a distance as Dad built this perfect, traditional family with Mom and me. I asked why he didn't just introduce himself like a normal person. Why this elaborate charade? He said Dad panicked when he first contacted him. Dad sent him money, told him to stay away. Said his life would be ruined if anyone found out. But Timothy kept pushing. He felt he deserved to know his father, to be part of the family. So Dad came up with the plan. Timothy claimed Dad convinced him that if he joined the family the right way, through marriage, it would be easier for everyone to accept. That once we were married and established, Dad would eventually reveal the truth, and everyone would be so used to Timothy being around, they'd just accept it. He actually tried to tell me this made sense to him at the time. He was desperate for a father, for a family, and he didn't think it through. Then I asked the question that truly mattered. When exactly did you figure out I was your sister? At what point in this insane plan did you realize you were being asked to marry your own half-sibling? Timothy looked down at his hands. He admitted it. Dad had told him from the very beginning, before we even met. He'd known the entire time. I lost it. Right there, in the middle of the food court. I screamed that he was just as sick as Dad, that I didn't care how desperate he was for family. What kind of person agrees to marry their own sister? People were staring, but I didn't care. Timothy tried to reach across the table, to take my hand, and I yanked it back so fast I knocked over my water. He started rambling about how maybe we could just go through with the ceremony and get it annulled quietly later. That Dad had convinced him it was the only way. That's when it hit me. Timothy wasn't some innocent victim. He was a grown man who had made a conscious choice to go along with this because it benefited him. He wanted access to Dad, to the family, to whatever legitimacy came with being acknowledged. And he was willing to destroy my life to get it. I stood up. Stay away from me. Stay away from my family. If you contact me again, I will tell everyone in Dad's church network exactly what you tried to do. I left him sitting there, shaking so hard I had to sit in my car for 20 minutes before I could drive. And that's when Mom called. Perfect timing, right? She wanted to know where I was because Dad was acting strange, and she needed help figuring out what was wrong with him. The guilt in her voice, worried about him, made me want to scream. I drove straight to their house. This had gone on long enough. Mom was in the kitchen. Dad was in the living room, and when he saw me, his face went gray. I looked at Mom and said, "We need to talk. All three of us. Right now." Mom put down her cutting board, confused. "What's going on? Why do you sound so serious?" Dad tried to intervene. "It's nothing, we can talk later." But I spoke over him. "Mom," I said, looking Dad dead in the eye, "Dad has something he needs to tell you. Something he should have told you 26 years ago." The look on Dad's face was like I'd physically hit him. He kept shaking his head. "We don't need to do this now. We should think about it first." Mom's expression shifted from confused to suspicious. "What are you talking about?" she demanded. I looked straight at Dad. "Go ahead. Tell her about Timothy. Tell her who he really is." And that's when he did something I never expected. He turned to Mom and denied everything. He said I'd misunderstood, that Timothy was exactly who they'd said he was, from the Brianna family. He even looked at me like I was crazy, asking Mom if she'd noticed me acting strange lately, if wedding stress was getting to me. Mom's eyes darted between us. "What are you talking about?" she asked again. I pulled out my phone. I played the voicemail Timothy had left me after our first confrontation, the one where he was crying, apologizing, saying Dad had manipulated him, and that he was sorry for going along with the plan to marry his half-sister. I watched Mom's face as Timothy's voice filled the kitchen, saying half-sister and Dad's plan. She gripped the counter, her knuckles white. "Dad," she asked, her voice dangerously quiet, "is this true?" Dad tried to say the recording was taken out of context, that Timothy was confused. But Mom's voice got very, very cold. "Stop lying to me. Did you have an affair? Is Timothy your son?" The silence in that kitchen stretched on forever. Finally, Dad sank into a chair and admitted it. The affair 26 years ago, before I was born. A mistake. The woman moved away. He sent money. Mom asked why Timothy was here now. Dad tried to explain his horrific plan about bringing him into the family through marriage to me. Mom's reaction wasn't what I expected. No screaming. No tears. She just looked at Dad with an expression of pure disgust. "Get out of my house," she said. Dad started to argue and she repeated it louder, firmer. "Pack a bag and leave. Don't come back until I say you can. I need time to think and I can't do that with you here." Dad looked at me like I had betrayed him. I stared right back. "You betrayed all of us first," I said. He left the kitchen, stomped upstairs. We heard him moving around. Mom sank into a chair, head in her hands. She asked how long I'd known. I told her I'd just found out about calling the church about confronting Dad. She said she'd been married to him for 27 years and never suspected a thing. She asked if I'd met Timothy again, and I told her about them all. She wanted to know if Timothy knew from the beginning. When I told her yes, that Dad had told him before we ever met, she stood up and walked to the sink. She said something that surprised me. I always thought there was something off about Timothy. Something too practiced. Too perfect. She dismissed it as nervousness. Now it made sense. Dad came back down with a duffel bag, tried to explain himself again. Mom held up her hand. "I don't want to hear it right now. I need space to process. I'll contact you when I'm ready. Until then, stay with Francis or find a hotel." Dad looked at me one last time, but I refused to feel guilty. After he left, Mom and I sat in the living room for hours. She wanted every detail, every red flag I'd noticed, everything Dad had said in the garage. I told her all of it. She asked about the wedding. "Obviously it's canceled," I said. Mom nodded. "I'll start making calls in the morning." But here's where it gets even more complicated. Around 9 p.m. Mom's phone rang. It was Francis, Dad's brother. He said Dad had just shown up at his house, spinning some story about me having a breakdown and calling off the wedding over nothing. Francis wanted to know what was really going on. Mom told him everything. I heard Francis go silent, then he started yelling. "What the hell is wrong with Dad?" Mom had to hold the phone away from her ear. Francis showed up 30 minutes later, a big man, looking ready to physically drag Dad back from his guest room. He paced, asking how Dad could be so stupid and selfish. He looked at me, genuinely apologetic, saying he had no idea any of this was happening, that Dad had never mentioned another son. Just then my phone buzzed. It was Timothy's actual mother. The woman I'd thought was part of some church family network. She said she'd heard what happened and wanted to talk. Wanted to explain her side. And that's where I was. Mom upstairs, figuring out how to cancel a wedding in less than 4 months. Francis in the kitchen, calling other family members to do damage control before Dad could spin this as me being unstable. And Timothy's mother wanted a conversation about her affair with my father and her role in this nightmare. I had no idea what was next. All I knew was that the man I was supposed to marry was my half-brother. My father was a manipulative liar willing to let us commit basically incest to cover up his affair. And my entire life had imploded in less than a week. Alright everyone. I'm back with what I hope is the last update to this absolute disaster. To everyone who's been following and leaving supportive comments, thank you. Seriously, I've read every single one. And they've kept me sane through 2 weeks of my life completely falling apart. When I left off, Timothy's mother had texted me. I ignored her for 2 days. I just couldn't handle another conversation with another person caught up in this mess. But she kept texting, not harassing, just gentle messages. She understood if I never wanted to speak to her, but she had things I deserved to know about Dad and Timothy. Finally, Saturday morning I was at Target, picking up stuff for Mom, who basically hadn't left the house since Dad moved out. I was staring at trash bags in the cleaning aisle when my phone buzzed again. Another text from Timothy's mother, whose name I now knew was Angelica. She was in town. Would I please meet her somewhere public just for 30 minutes? I texted back, fine. Riverside Park in an hour. The one with the walking trail. If she tried anything crazy, at least there'd be joggers and dog walkers around. I finished shopping, dropped everything off at Mom's and drove to the park. Angelica was already there, at a picnic table near the playground. I recognized her immediately from the few family dinners we'd had when I thought she was just Timothy's nice, traditional mom. She looked older than I remembered, tired. She stood up as I walked over, didn't try to hug me, just gestured to the bench across from her. She started by apologizing. Not the fake kind, but a raw, genuine apology. She was sorry for everything that had happened, for terrible choices 26 years ago, and even worse choices in the past year. I sat down. I didn't come here for apologies, I said. I came for answers. How could you let your son agree to marry his own half-sister? Angelica looked down at her hands. She claimed she didn't know that was the plan until it was already happening. When Timothy first told her he'd made contact with Dad and they were building a relationship, she thought he'd finally get the father figure he always wanted. She admitted she'd been young and stupid during the affair. Dad had promised he'd leave his wife, but then I was born and he stayed. She'd raised Timothy alone, always feeling guilty he didn't have a father. I asked point blank, "When did you find out about the marriage plan?" Angelica said Timothy told her dad had this idea about bringing him into the family through marriage, to legitimize everything. She immediately told him no, that it was insane, wrong, and he needed to walk away. But Timothy had been so desperate for Dad's approval that he convinced himself it would work. According to Angelica, Timothy believed Dad's promise that the marriage would just be a formality, that they'd get it annulled quietly after a year or so, once everyone was used to him being around. She said she'd threatened to tell everyone the truth, but Timothy begged her not to ruin his chance at having a real family. So she stayed silent, hating herself for it. I asked why she was telling me this now. She said Timothy had shown up at her hotel room the night after our mall conversation, absolutely destroyed. He'd admitted he'd actually developed real feelings for me during our supervised visits, that he'd started to convince himself maybe we could make it work somehow. That's when Angelica realized how deep into this delusion both Timothy and Dad had gotten. The way she described it made me want to throw up. Timothy had convinced himself that since we'd never met until adulthood and didn't grow up together, it wasn't really that wrong. That we could be married and just never tell anyone the truth. Angelica said she'd told him he needed therapy, and to stay far away from me and my family. I asked where Timothy was now. Angelica said he'd gone back to Wisconsin. She bought him a plane ticket and drove him to the airport herself. He was planning to stay with friends there and figure out his life away from all of this. That, I told her, is probably the smartest decision anyone in this situation has made. She then asked about Dad. If he was still defending himself or if he'd taken responsibility. I told her the truth. He was with Francis, still trying to spin it as a misunderstanding. Angelica shook her head. Sounds exactly like the man I remember from 26 years ago. When I finally got back to Mom's house that evening, the place was packed. Francis was there with his wife, Ivy. Mom's sister, Darren, had driven 2 hours. Even Melanie was there. Apparently, Mom had called her for support. The conversation stopped when I walked in. Francis asked where I'd been. I told them about meeting Angelica and Timothy. Going back to Wisconsin. Darren wanted to know if we could trust he'd stay away. Francis, ever the protective uncle, vowed that if Timothy showed his face again, he'd personally make sure he regretted it. Mom had been quiet, but then she spoke up. "We need to talk about Dad." She'd spent the morning on the phone with the divorce attorney. Not because she definitely decided on divorce, she made that clear, but because she needed to understand her options. The attorney had told her that Dad's affair and the financial support he'd been sending Timothy all these years would be major factors in any settlement. That's when Francis dropped another bomb. He said Dad had been using money from the family business to send to Timothy. Francis and Dad co-owned a small accounting firm their father had started. Francis had gone through the books after Dad moved in with him. He'd found regular transfers to an account in Wisconsin for years. Thousands of dollars Dad had been hiding from everyone. Mom went very still. "How much money exactly?" she asked. Francis said he was still going through everything, but it looked like at least $70,000 over the years, maybe more. Money that should have gone to business expenses, or our family savings. Money Mom had never known about. Ivy started talking about confronting Dad, saying he couldn't just hide at Francis's, avoiding consequences. Darren agreed. Someone needed to make him face what he'd done to this family. Mom said she wasn't ready to see him, but she wanted Francis to tell him that she knew about the money, and her attorney would be contacting him. That night, after everyone left, Mom and I sat in the kitchen. She asked me how I was really doing. Not the polite way people ask, but truly asking. I told her honestly, "I feel like my entire life has been a lie. I followed every single rule you both set for me. Stayed pure, traditional, obedient. And look where it got me. Almost married to my own brother because Dad was too much of a coward to admit he'd had an affair. Mom started crying. Real gut-wrenching sobs, not the quiet tears she'd shed before. She said she'd failed me as a mother. That she should have questioned why Timothy seemed so practiced, so perfect. That she should have protected me better. I told her it wasn't her fault, that Dad had lied to both of us. But here's the thing that really got to me. Mom said she'd been thinking about all the rules they'd raised me with. The no dating until marriage thing, the supervised visits. All of it. She'd always thought those rules were protecting me. But really? They just made me vulnerable. I'd never had the chance to date normally, to learn what real relationships felt like, to develop my own instincts about when something was wrong. I'd been so desperate to follow the rules, to make them proud, that I'd ignored every single red flag with Timothy. She apologized for that. For raising me in a way that made me easy to manipulate. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to be angry, but mostly I was just tired. The next few days were a blur of canceling wedding vendors. Mom and I divided the list and started making calls. The venue was the worst. A non-refundable deposit of $3,000 gone. The dress, that was the hardest. 2 fittings down, the final one next week. The bridal shop said they could resell it if it hadn't been altered too much, but we'd lose half. Sell it, I told Mom. I never want to see that dress again. Through all of this, Dad kept trying to reach out. Long rambling texts about how I needed to understand. That he'd only been trying to help Timothy. That bringing him into the family seemed like the right thing to do. That I was too young to understand how complicated adult relationships were. I finally texted back. Manipulating your daughter isn't complicated. It's evil. Stop contacting me. Then he showed up. Thursday. Mom had gone to the grocery store, and I was alone, sorting through RSVPs we now needed to uninvite. I heard his key in the lock, and came out to find him standing in the entryway, looking uncomfortable. What are you doing here? I asked. This is my house too, he said defensively. I have a right to get some of my things. He ignored my warning that Mom had told him not to come without calling, and walked past me toward the stairs. I followed him up to the bedroom. He started pulling clothes, trying to make small talk. How are you doing? Have you talked to Timothy? I told him Timothy was in Wisconsin, thank God, and that I'd met with Angelica. Dad froze, a shirt in his hands. What did she tell you? He asked, his voice tight. She told me everything, I said. About how you promised her you'd leave Mom 26 years ago, and then didn't. About how you've been sending money to Timothy all these years. About how you convinced Timothy that marrying me was somehow a legitimate plan. Dad put the shirt down, turned to face me. He tried to explain that things had been complicated back then, that he'd made mistakes, but he'd been trying to make them right. I looked at him, disbelief washing over me. How exactly did having me marry my half-brother make anything right? He said if I would just listen, he could explain the whole plan, that it made sense if I understood all the pieces. And that's when it truly hit me. Dad actually still believed he'd done nothing wrong. He genuinely thought his plan had been reasonable, and everyone else was just overreacting. He started telling me about how hard it had been to balance supporting Timothy secretly while maintaining his life here. How stressful it was to keep the secret all these years. I cut him off. I don't care, I said, my voice shaking with fury. You had 26 years to tell the truth. Instead, you chose to manipulate everyone around you. You were willing to let me marry Timothy and live a lie forever just so you didn't have to face the consequences for your affair. You are selfish and delusional. And I want nothing to do with you. Dad's face changed. It went cold. He said I was acting like a child throwing a tantrum. That when I matured and had my own adult relationships, I'd understand that sometimes you have to make hard choices. That he'd been protecting me by not telling me the truth sooner. I actually laughed. A bitter, hollow sound. Protecting me? Protecting me would have been not introducing me to Timothy in the first place. Protecting me would have been dealing with your own mess instead of dragging me into it. I spent 24 years following every single rule you and Mom set, being the perfect, obedient daughter. And this is how you repay that trust. He tried to reach for my shoulder. I stepped back. Finish packing your stuff and get out, I said. He asked where he was supposed to go. I don't care. Francis's house, a hotel, back to Wisconsin. Just not here. Mom came home while Dad was still packing. She took one look at his car in the driveway and walked inside, ready for a fight. She found us both in the bedroom. What do you think you're doing? She asked Dad. He started to complain about being kicked out of his own house. Mom's voice was calm but lethal. You kicked yourself out when you decided to have an affair and lie about it for 26 years. They started arguing. Real arguing. Not the polite disagreements of my childhood. Mom brought up the money Francis had found. How could you steal from your own business and family to support your secret son? Dad tried to say it wasn't stealing, it was his money too. He could use it how he wanted. Mom retorted. That money should have gone to our actual family. To my college fund, to our retirement, to the mortgage. Dad actually said, Timothy is my actual family too. I had a responsibility to support my son. Mom's gaze was piercing. Why was that responsibility more important than being honest with your wife and daughter? He had no answer. The argument went on for maybe 20 minutes before Dad finally grabbed his bag and left. Mom and I stood at the bedroom window watching him drive away. She turned to me. I'm calling my attorney on Monday to file for divorce. She'd spent 2 weeks trying to decide if the marriage could be saved. But after seeing him today, after hearing him still defend his choices, she knew. It was over. I asked if she was sure. I've never been more sure of anything, she said. I spent 27 years married to a man capable of this level of deception and manipulation. I'm done. The church community found out about everything the following Sunday. I don't know who told them, maybe Francis, maybe Dad tried to spin his version. But by that afternoon my phone was blowing up. Mom and I decided not to go to service that day or the next. We needed space. Melanie came over and we spent the day watching movies, eating pizza, and just not talking about Dad or Timothy. It was the first normal day I'd had in weeks. By Monday, Francis told us Dad had moved out of his house too. Apparently, Ivy had made it crystal clear Dad wasn't welcome after what he'd done. Dad had gotten a short-term rental across town. Francis said Dad was still working at the firm, but they'd had a serious conversation about the money, and Dad had agreed to pay back everything he'd taken. So that's it. That's the end of this nightmare. My engagement is canceled. My parents are getting divorced. I'm moving out on my own. And I'm finally starting to build a life that's actually mine, instead of one that blindly follows someone else's rules. If you've ever been in a situation where family or tradition, or even religion was used to manipulate you, you know how soul-crushing it can be. Trust your gut. Question everything. And don't be afraid to break those rules when following them means destroying yourself. Seriously, what would you have done in my shoes? Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and your own sanity? I really want to hear your thoughts in the comments below.